a rich family refused to let their black maid attend her father's funeral. Days later, their secret was exposed. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from today. Before the sun came up, Amira quietly tied her apron in the kitchen of the big Whitmore house. The grand chandelier above her glowed softly, casting shadows on the marble counters. She moved around the kitchen with ease by doing her work without thinking much. She reached for the French press, the kettle, and the delicate cups from the night before. The kitchen smelled fresh like lemon and cleaning supplies. It was her job to clean and make everything perfect after everyone had gone to bed. She didn't need to check the clock. She already knew what to do. Amira had worked in the Whitmore house for 12 years, waking up early every day to make breakfast for the family. They never really noticed her. To them, she was just the maid. Sometimes they called her dear when they were being polite, or girl when they weren't. Amira had once hoped they might be kinder, maybe say thank you, or smile at her. But now, in her 40s, she had stopped expecting that. She was tired and her body hurt after years of hard work, but she still did it all without complaint. When the coffee was ready and the scones were warm, the sun was just starting to rise. The big house stood cold and grand, 3 stories tall, filled with paintings of the family's ancestors. Amira worked quietly, dusting and straightening everything before the Whitmores woke up. Mrs. Whitmore was the first to come down the stairs. She was an older lady, very fancy, with perfect platinum hair. She didn't look at Amira much. She just told her, warm, not hot, about the coffee. Amira made sure the coffee was just right and stepped back, blending into the background. The daughters, Belinda and Ashley, came in next. They were in their 20s and looked just like their mom. They wore expensive loungewear and spent most of their time on their phones. They didn't notice Amira, and when they talked, it wasn't nice. "Did you see what Darla wore to the club last night? It was awful." Belinda laughed. "It looked like something the maid would wear," Ashley giggled. Amira heard the joke, but she didn't react. She had gotten used to people being rude to her. She just kept doing her work, moving quietly and without being noticed. After breakfast, Amira cleared the table and carried the dishes to the kitchen. The chef wouldn't be there for a while, so she washed the fine china by hand, being very careful. The rest of her day went just like every other. She cleaned, vacuumed, prepared lunch for the daughters, and did everything else that was expected of her. There were no breaks, no time to relax. By the time evening came, her legs hurt and she was tired, but she still worked. At dinner, the Whitmores sat at the long table. Amira served each course quietly, careful not to make any noise. The family barely noticed her. During dinner, Belinda said, "I don't know why anyone would want to do this job. It must be so sad." Ashley agreed. "Yeah, people like her don't really have lives. They're just like the furniture." Amira felt the sting of their words but didn't show it. She had learned to hide her feelings and keep her head down. After the meal, she went to her small room in the servants' wing. It was simple, with just a bed and a small window. She sat on the edge of the bed, her feet sore and her back aching. She opened a drawer and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a picture of her father, smiling with her when she was little. She hadn't seen him in 2 years. The last time they spoke, he asked when she would come home, and she promised it would be soon. But work had always been too busy, and now he was gone. She lay back on her bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was so quiet. She could hear the sound of glasses clinking in the dining room, the laughter of people who didn't care if she was tired or lonely. To them, she was just a shadow, someone always there but never seen. That night, she dreamed of her father's voice. He had always told her, "You're worth more than they ever admit. Don't let them make you small." She had believed him once, but now the next morning came, and it was like every other morning. She got up, adjusted her collar, and went about her work without thinking, but then something changed. While she was setting the table, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her sister, Lorna. Amira hadn't heard from her in weeks. The message was short. "Call me now. It's Papa." Her heart sank and she quickly called her sister. The words that came through the phone didn't make sense at first. Lorna's voice was shaky. "He's gone," she said softly. "Papa died last night." Amira couldn't understand. The words seemed to float in the air. Her father, the man who had always been there for her, was gone. She leaned against the wall, feeling like the floor was falling out from under her. She barely heard her sister's tears on the other end of the phone. She hung up the phone without realizing it and just stood there, staring. The world around her hadn't changed. The Whitmores were still upstairs, getting ready for their day. But everything inside Amira felt different. She couldn't pretend anymore. She had to leave. She walked back to the dining room and served Mrs. Whitmore her coffee, her hands shaking. The daughters talked about their weekend plans, but Amira couldn't hear them. Her mind was still with her father. By mid-morning, she couldn't keep it in anymore. She went to Mrs. Whitmore's sitting room. Mrs. Whitmore was sitting at her vanity, putting on her lipstick. Amira stood at the door and cleared her throat. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "I just received a call. My father passed away last night. I'd like to take a few days to go to the funeral." Mrs. Whitmore didn't turn around. She didn't seem surprised. "We have a big event this weekend. The house needs to be perfect. We can't afford to fall behind." Amira blinked. "It's just 4 days. I'll come back before the event." Finally, Mrs. Whitmore turned around and looked at her, her face cold. "I'm sorry for your loss, but this isn't a good time. We'll manage without you, but it will be difficult. If you insist on leaving, you'll lose your bonus." The words hit Amira hard, like ice in her chest. She felt small, but she nodded. She couldn't stay angry. It wouldn't do any good. Just then, Mr. Whitmore walked in and asked what was wrong. Mrs. Whitmore told him, "She wants to leave. Her father died." Mr. Whitmore looked up, his eyebrows scrunched. "That's unfortunate timing. The gala is very important. We can offer a double bonus if she stays. She's needed here." Amira's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She felt her hands clenching at her sides. Her father's face appeared in her mind. The last photo they took together. He was sitting on the porch, smiling through the pain he never admitted. She swallowed hard. "Please," she said quietly. "It's just a few days. You know how important this weekend is." "Amira," Mr. Whitmore said, "surely your family will understand." Amira stood there feeling numb. She didn't know if she was more shocked by their refusal or by how unsurprised she was. They weren't angry. They weren't cruel. They were just indifferent. That hurt more. Her pain didn't matter to them. It was just another problem in the way. "I'll think about it," she murmured, turning quickly so they wouldn't see her face. She went to her room before the tears came. They fell silently, hot and fast, soaking into the fabric of her apron. She sat on the edge of her bed, holding the photo of her father against her chest. There was a heaviness inside her that she couldn't explain. It was like she had been struck so many times that she had cracked. That night she kept working. She served dinner, cleared the dishes, washed and folded linens. No one asked how she was. No one mentioned her loss. As she moved through the hallways like a ghost, she could hear laughter behind closed doors, glasses clinking, and the hum of wealth as if everything was fine. In the dark of her room, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The weight in her chest wouldn't go away. It felt like something alive, pressing into her ribs, demanding to be named. She had spent years swallowing every injustice, but this was different. This wasn't about a wrinkled tablecloth or a cold cup of coffee. This was about her father. This was her last chance to say goodbye. And they told her it didn't matter. She sat up, pulled her suitcase from beneath her bed, and began to pack. Slowly, carefully. She folded each piece of clothing like she was preparing for something big. She placed the photograph of her father on top and zipped the suitcase shut. Her movements were steady now, calm. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the hedges. The sky was dark. There was no moon. She knew what she had to do. She wouldn't be here in the morning. The house was still asleep when Amira opened her door. It was just past 4 in the morning, that quiet time when the world seemed to be holding its breath. She stood for a moment in the doorway, her hand resting on the edge of the frame. She looked back into the small room that had been hers for 12 years. It was never really hers. It had only held fatigue and quiet grief. There were no decorations, no books, no special memories. Just a cot, a chair, and a nightstand where her father's picture had stood like a secret altar. Now the nightstand was bare. She moved through the servants' corridor, her suitcase wheels whispering against the polished floor. The grand hallway was silent. The chandeliers above were unlit. The tall windows were still dark. She walked past them without hesitation. She had polished those windows, scrubbed their sills with a toothbrush. She had dusted the chandeliers while the Whitmores laughed at parties below. All of it felt so far away now, like someone else's memory. In the kitchen, she paused. Her apron hung on its hook. The schedule clipboard was where she had left it. The faint smell of coffee grounds lingered from the night before. She placed a folded piece of paper on the counter. It only had a few lines written in her careful handwriting. "Thank you for the opportunity. I will not be returning. Respectfully, Amira Holt." She stood there for a second, then turned and walked toward the back door. Her fingers had just closed around the handle when a voice stopped her. Leaving without saying goodbye? Mr. Whitmore stood in the doorway behind her, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. His hair was damp, as if he had just showered. His tone was calm, almost curious. Amira straightened her shoulders but didn't turn around. "Yes, that's a shame. I thought we had an understanding." She turned now, her voice quiet but steady. "You made it clear yesterday that we do not." He sighed, stepping further into the kitchen. "You're overreacting. I know you're upset, and I'm sorry for your loss, but we had an agreement. You work, we pay you well. That gala was important." She looked him directly in the eyes. "My father's funeral is more important." He frowned, like he didn't understand. "You should have stayed. Loyalty matters in this world. People who show loyalty are rewarded. Others are replaceable." Amira felt the familiar heat rise in her chest, the warning signal of tears, anger, or humiliation. But it didn't take over this time. She drew a long, slow breath. "I gave you 12 years, she said. 12 years of my hands, my feet, my silence. I cooked your meals. I raised your children when you were too busy. I ironed your sheets, polished your crystal, and took your insults. I missed birthdays, holidays, and my niece's graduation. And now you ask me to miss my father's funeral?" He opened his mouth, but she raised her hand. "I'm not asking for anything anymore. I'm leaving. You don't have to understand. You just have to let me go." For a moment, he said nothing. Then, with a faint smirk, he stepped aside. "Suit yourself. You'll regret this. No one's lining up to hire someone with your background. You had a good deal here. Comfort, security. You'll see." She looked at him, really looked at him. The man who had once seemed so large and in control. Now, in the gray morning light, he seemed small. His voice, so often the final word, now sounded tired. And in that moment, she saw him clearly. He was a man who had never once thought of her as a person. Without another word, she walked past him, opened the door, and stepped outside into the still morning air. The street was quiet. The sky was a muted gray. The trees stood still. She walked quickly to the gate, her suitcase rolling behind her. The sound of its wheels was strangely satisfying. The security camera above the gate turned toward her, then stopped. She wondered if anyone was watching. Was Mrs. Whitmore awake now, reading her note with pursed lips, wondering how the help could be so ungrateful? She didn't care. The taxi she had called hours ago waited at the curb. The driver stepped out and helped her with the bag without speaking. She slid into the back seat, shut the door, and only then allowed herself to exhale. As the estate disappeared behind her, She felt a strange sensation rise in her chest. Lightness. It wasn't joy. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter. Maybe freedom, or maybe just relief. She leaned her head against the window as the car moved through the city. The streets were just waking up. Bakeries opened their shutters. Newspaper vendors set up their stalls. In the city where she had lived in the shadows for over a decade, no one noticed her leave. And somehow, that felt fitting. At the station, she boarded the early train south. Her ticket was in one hand, her suitcase in the other. She found a seat by the window and settled in, watching the landscape blur past. Trees, fields, tiny towns. Each mile was a step taking her back to the place she had left so long ago, believing it had nothing for her. She arrived in her hometown just as the sun rose. The station was small, just one platform, surrounded by dusty roads and overgrown grass. She stepped off the train and stood for a moment, breathing in the air. It smelled like earth and morning dew. It smelled like memories. Her sister Lorna was there, waiting. Lorna was thinner than she remembered. Her hair streaked with gray, her eyes tired. But when she saw Amira, her face broke into something between a sob and a smile. They embraced without words, holding each other tightly. The years and distance fell away. They walked home together, arm in arm. The silence between them was full of meaning. Along the way, neighbors peeked from windows, recognizing her. An old man on his porch waved. A little boy on a bicycle smiled and waved too. She was no longer invisible here. The house was smaller than she remembered, but still standing strong. When she stepped inside, she smelled fried plantains and sage. The front porch creaked under her feet, the paint peeling in familiar patterns. Inside, the rooms were filled with flowers, visitors, and quiet weeping. Her father's chair was empty, but the memory of him lingered everywhere. In the photographs on the wall, the worn boots by the door, the hand-carved walking stick leaning against the table. She moved through the house like someone stepping into an old skin, rediscovering who she had once been. Later that evening, after the house had quieted, she sat alone in her father's room. Her suitcase sat unopened in the corner. In her lap was the same photograph she had carried for years. It was of her father holding her at the edge of their small garden, both of them beaming. "I'm home," she whispered. The funeral would be in 2 days. There would be stories, songs, prayers, and laughter. But for now, in the quiet room, she allowed herself to grieve and feel the full weight of loss. And for the first time in years, she cried without hiding. The rain came before the sun, thin at first, then heavier, draping the town in a wet hush that felt just right, as if the sky itself was mourning with them. Amira stood by the window of her childhood bedroom, watching the raindrops race down the glass, her arms wrapped loosely around herself. The house around her stirred, murmured voices from the kitchen, footsteps on the stairs, someone clearing their throat to hold back emotion. The scent of boiled cassava and strong coffee mixed with the heavy dampness of the air. Everything in the house was smaller and more sacred than she remembered. The faded sofa in the living room, the crooked photograph on the wall of her parents laughing together. The floorboards still creaked in the same places. The screen door at the back still hung slightly off its hinge. Time had touched the house gently. And now, death had reached in and changed everything. Amira had not unpacked her suitcase. It stood near the foot of the bed, a reminder of the life she had left behind. Neatly packed, practical, silent. Her city shoes were now streaked with dust from the train station and the walk through town. Her funeral dress, pressed the night before, hung from the back of the door. It was a simple black garment, modest and soft. But when she slipped into it, she felt its weight settle over her like a shroud. Her sister, Lorna, entered without knocking. She held a steaming mug in her hands. She looked tired, her eyes rimmed red. "Have some," she said, offering the cup. Amira took it, murmured her thanks, and sat on the edge of the bed. "He loved the rain," Lorna said, looking out the window. "He said it made the world honest." Amira nodded. She could almost hear his voice saying those very words, rough and amused. He stood on the porch, letting the rain fall over him. His hat was crooked, and he didn't mind getting wet. He was always like that, unbothered by things that made other people uncomfortable. She missed him so much, it hurt to breathe. The church was on the edge of town. It was a small white building with a steeple that leaned a little to the left. The paint on the church had started to peel off from many years of storms and rain, but the doors still opened wide and the pews still held people mourning. By the time they got there, the parking lot was already full. Neighbors, family, and friends who had known her dad as a kind mechanic, a mentor, and a man of dignity came to say goodbye. They wore suits and dresses that weren't new, but carefully fixed. They brought umbrellas, food, comfort, and songs. They brought memories. Inside the church, the air smelled like wood, candles, and flowers. Lots of flowers. There were white lilies, chrysanthemums, and red roses. At the front of the church was the coffin. It was simple, polished, and covered with a folded flag. There was also a picture of her father smiling beside a broken tractor he had fixed by himself. Amira walked slowly to the front with her sister, their hands holding tightly. She looked at the picture and her heart hurt. His eyes were kind and full of love, just like she remembered. She could almost hear him whispering a joke to make her smile, telling her not to cry. But he was gone. The service started with a hymn. People sang in harmonies, their voices shaky but strong. The pastor, a tall man with a gentle voice, talked about her father's life, his love for his daughters, his belief that working hard and being kind was important. Lorna, a neighbor, read a poem, and someone told a funny story about her dad fixing a whole neighborhood's power line with just a ladder, a hammer, and faith. The people laughed through their tears. When it was Amira's turn to speak, her legs shook. She walked slowly to the front, holding a piece of paper in her hand. Even though she knew the words by heart, she looked at the paper anyway. She saw the faces of people who remembered her as a little girl, and now they were seeing her come back, grieving. "My father wasn't a rich man," she started, her voice soft but steady. "He never traveled far or wanted to be famous, but he had something more important. He gave with his hands, with his time, and he believed in showing up, even when it was hard, especially then." She took a deep breath. "I didn't get to say goodbye. I was too far away, caught up in a life where I became small so others could feel bigger. I let that happen for too long. I let it happen until I forgot what my father taught me, that my worth is not about how well I serve others, but about how I honor my own truth." She looked down at the coffin, and her eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Papa. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me, but I'm here now, and I promise I won't let your voice disappear." The room was quiet, respectful. She sat down, her heart pounding. Her sister squeezed her hand. The service continued with more songs, a final prayer, and then the slow procession to the cemetery behind the church. The rain had become heavier, soaking the grass and turning the ground into mud. People opened their umbrellas, and Amira stood with her sister, holding a photo of her father. She couldn't let it go. In the picture, he was standing in the garden with a big smile, wearing a sun hat, looking unbothered by the heat. It was taken during her last visit home before she had to leave for a long time. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, the sound of the ropes and pulleys could barely be heard over the rain. Amira's knees buckled, and a sob escaped her. She didn't try to stop it. Her grief had its place here, surrounded by the people who loved her father. "I'm sorry," she whispered, pressing the photo to her chest. "I should have been here. I should have held your hand." Then her family gathered around her. Lorna, cousins, aunts. They surrounded her in silence, their warmth giving her comfort. It didn't make the guilt go away, but it helped soften the pain. "He knew," Lorna said softly, holding her. "He always knew you loved him." The rain didn't stop. It soaked everyone, making their clothes heavy and their hair stick to their faces. But no one moved when the last bit of dirt hit the coffin. Amira closed her eyes. The sound felt like an ending and a beginning. Later, after the funeral, the house was filled with people again. They brought food, stories, hugs, and laughter, trying to bring light to the darkness. The house hummed with conversation. Children ran around, and old friends clinked glasses in remembrance. It was just the kind of gathering her father would have loved, simple and warm. Amira sat on the porch, her legs curled up under her. She watched the rain fall, and for the first time in a long time, she felt present. She listened to the voices behind her, the laughter and soft cries, and felt herself starting to come back to life. Ezra, her nephew, came up to her with a notebook under his arm. He was 23, bright and thoughtful. He was a local journalist, writing small stories about the community. He sat beside her and handed her a paper towel. "You said something at the church," he said softly, "about being made small." Amira nodded, unsure what he was getting at. "I've been writing a column," Ezra continued, "just small pieces about people's lives. Would you want to share your story?" Amira stared at him, her heart racing. "My story?" "Not with names," I said quickly. "Not even yours if you don't want. But what happened to you matters. People need to hear it." Amira looked down at her hands. They were rough with calluses from years of hard work. The idea of sharing her story scared her, but it also made something inside her stir, something that wanted to be heard. She didn't answer right away, but she didn't say no. That night, after the guests had gone and the house was quiet again, Amira sat at her father's old desk. She picked up the photo of him, and for the first time, she started to write. She didn't write everything, but she wrote enough. She wrote about the silence, the coldness, the years of being invisible. She wrote about the day she left and the promise she made at his grave that she would never again let anyone decide her worth. It was the first time she'd ever told the truth, and she wasn't done yet. 2 days after the funeral, Amira woke up. The rain smell still lingered in the house, and the sorrow hung heavy in the walls. She lay there, not moving, for the first time in years. There were no schedules, no chores, no demands to obey, just peace. She walked barefoot through the house, hearing the voices of family and neighbors. Her niece was coloring at the kitchen table. Lorna was on the phone, and there was a basket of fresh plantains on the counter. For the first time in years, Amira felt like she belonged, like she was a part of something sacred. She made coffee just like her father used to, using his old spoon. She stood at the stove and tried not to think of the fancy kitchens of people who didn't care. Instead, she focused on the small, comforting sounds of the house, the scrape of a chair, the laugh of a child. Ezra arrived after breakfast, carrying his notebook. He was quiet, like he had been thinking a lot. He hugged her and pointed to the porch. "Walk?" he asked. She nodded, and they stepped outside. The rain had stopped, and everything was fresh and new. They walked in silence until they reached an old wooden bench under a mango tree. Ezra opened his notebook and began flipping through the pages. "I worked on your story," he said. "I cleaned it up a little, just the grammar and structure, but I didn't change your voice." Amira felt her heart race. "And I submitted it last night," he said. Amira stared at him. "You submitted it?" "No names," he promised. "It's called the Maid's Letter. Just your story, the way you told it." She was shocked, but didn't say anything. 100 emotions rushed through her: fear, pride, uncertainty, hope. "Why didn't you wait?" she asked quietly. "Because it needed to be told," Ezra said, "and I think the world needed to hear it." They didn't speak after that. The wind moved through the trees, sending a gentle shower of petals to the ground. Amira closed her eyes, listening to the sounds around her, feeling her heart tremble. When they went back home, the silence felt different. Not empty, but full of anticipation. That night, the calls started. The first was from a local editor. Then came a request from a radio show. The article spread quickly on social media. reaching more and more people. Amira stayed up late reading the messages Ezra forwarded to her. There were dozens, then hundreds of women who had worked just like she did. Many of them had never told anyone about their struggles. "I thought it was just me," one message said. "I never told anyone what they did to me," said another. "Thank you for giving us a voice," one woman wrote. Amira cried that night, holding the old photo of her father. Her tears weren't just for him, but for herself, for the girl she had been, for the years she spent making herself small, for the woman who had finally said no. Within days, the article reached a big blog about workers' rights. They asked for an interview. Amira didn't answer. Not yet. But she let them print the story exactly as it was. Soon, a famous news outlet picked it up. Then a celebrity shared it, and it went viral. Amira didn't leave the house for 3 days. She stayed mostly in the back room, reading the messages. Her sister talked to people, explaining that Amira wasn't ready for interviews yet, that she needed space to grieve. But it wasn't just grief anymore. It was something bigger, something unstoppable. One afternoon, Lorna walked into Amira's room holding a newspaper. "They say this is about the Whitmores," she said, her voice low. Amira froze. Someone figured out the details, a former worker, and now people are talking. The newspaper had an article that put together information from secret sources, financial records, and complaints. It showed a bad picture of how the Whitmore family treated their workers. The article included stories not yet proven but strong about workers being yelled at, not getting paid, and being treated badly because of their race. Suddenly, the Whitmores were the topic of news everywhere. News anchors on TV talked about the right or wrong way to treat workers. Talk shows had guests discussing jobs and homes and how to treat workers with respect. Social media was full of hashtags supporting the author of A Maid's Letter. Through all of this, Amira stayed quiet. She wasn't silent because she was scared, but because she felt powerful. She watched as the people who once ignored her pain tried to protect their names. A photo appeared of Mrs. Whitmore getting into a fancy car, hiding her face behind big sunglasses, her mouth tight. Reporters surrounded their big house, and drones flew over their yards. Stories came out saying the Whitmores had lost important jobs and were no longer invited to fancy parties. Amira didn't smile because of this, but she didn't feel sorry for them either. One evening, she sat on the porch with Lorna, watching the fireflies in the dark sky. Lorna's little girl had fallen asleep nearby, holding a stuffed rabbit. Amira said quietly, "I think I'm ready." Lorna looked at her, her eyes kind. "Ready for what?" she asked. "Ready to stop hiding." The next morning, Amira made a recording. She didn't say names, and she didn't shout. She simply told her story for a podcast about workers' rights. She spoke about what it felt like to be invisible, about the day she was told her father's death wasn't as important as cleaning dishes, and how she walked away from a life that was hurting her. When the podcast was shared, it quickly spread all over. People cried, people stood up, and people remembered her story. Amira, who once worked quietly cleaning floors, became a symbol of waking up to the truth, not revenge. She didn't want fame or pity, she just wanted the truth to be heard, and once it was said, it couldn't be ignored. The Whitmore name started to fade. People stopped talking about them, they lost their work and their friends. No amount of money could fix what was revealed. But Amira, she had found something far more precious than wealth. She had found her voice, and the world was listening. The next morning, sunlight came through the lace curtains in Amira's room, soft and golden. She woke up slowly, not in a rush. There was no alarm or worry about things she had forgotten to do. There were no voices in her head telling her what to do. It was just light, warmth, and peace. It had been almost a month since her story spread everywhere, causing talks, protests, and apologies she never asked for. Amira had stepped away from the storm, not because she was afraid, but because she needed something quieter. The Whitmores weren't her worry anymore. Their faces were gone from the news. replaced by new, louder stories. But Amira's silence had done what it needed to do. Now it was time for her to rebuild. One morning, Lorna gave her a flyer. She placed it on the kitchen table next to a plate of warm food. "They need help at the shelter," she said gently. "Not cleaning, not like before, but as a coordinator, someone who understands these women's struggles." Amira looked at the flyer. It was simple, saying the shelter needed someone to help women and children. They wanted someone with experience and kindness. She didn't say yes right away. She didn't say no either. She took the flyer with her as she walked through the town, past places where she had memories. She walked past the market where she bought sugarcane as a child, past the school where her father had helped fix the roof for free, and past the house with the green shutters where her cousin had taught her to braid. The town held so many memories, each one tender and sweet. That night, Amira sat by the window with a notebook. She stared at the blank page for a long time, then wrote one sentence: "I want to do something that matters." The next morning, she sent in her application. The shelter was in a simple brick building at the edge of town, behind a small clinic. When Amira arrived, it was quiet. The air smelled like soap and wildflowers. A young woman greeted her with excitement and showed her around. There were toys in the main room, clothes on racks, and a bulletin board with helpful information. The director, Vivian, was kind but serious. She interviewed Amira over tea. She had read the article and listened to the podcast, but didn't mention them until the end. "I don't need a symbol," she said. "I need someone who shows up every day and understands what it's like to be invisible. Can you do that?" Amira said, "Yes, I can." She started the next week. The work wasn't hard, but it was important. She didn't have to clean anymore. Instead, she talked with women. Some had bruises hidden under scarves. Others had children with them. Some women were too tired to speak at all. Amira listened to them, wrote down their stories, and helped them find the things they needed to start over. At first, the women didn't trust her. They thought she was just another worker in charge. But over time, they saw the way she acted. She folded clothes without complaining, she listened closely when they talked, and she was kind. One woman, Delia, came in with her 2 kids. Her husband had kicked her out one night with no shoes and a hurt face. Delia didn't speak for 3 days. Amira brought her food and warm towels without saying anything. On the 4th day, Delia whispered, "Thank you." The next day, Delia asked Amira to help her fill out forms for a new home. Another woman asked Amira, "How do you stay calm?" Amira answered, "I've been through worse, but I know it gets better each day." At the shelter, Amira became a part of a new life. She no longer cared about cleaning floors or shining silverware. She saw her worth in the way people relaxed when they saw her, the way children reached for her hand, and how people trusted her. On weekends, she went for walks, wrote in her journal, and visited her father's grave. She told him about the women she helped and how much she was learning. Life, in its simplest form, had returned. One day, a woman from a local university called. She was planning a panel about labor rights and wanted Amira to speak. Amira wasn't sure if she wanted to be in the spotlight again, but Vivian encouraged her. "Your voice started something. You don't have to shout to be heard." So Amira agreed. She stood on a small stage in front of a group of students and community leaders. She didn't have a prepared speech. She spoke from the heart. "I used to believe my silence kept me safe," she told them. "But silence only protected the people who used it against me. It didn't protect me." She paused and looked at the people in front of her. "I walked away from a life that made me small. Now I help others do the same. I'm not anyone's maid anymore. I'm a woman who listens, who remembers, and who understands." When she finished, the audience didn't cheer loudly, but they stood quietly, showing respect for her words. Afterward, a young woman came up to her, crying. "I work for a family like that," she said. "I thought I had no choice." Amira held her hand and said, "You always have a choice." That night, 3 more women asked her for advice. One asked for a hug, and one simply said, "Thank you." Back at the shelter, the children greeted Amira with drawings. The women smiled when she entered the room. Amira was no longer seen as just the maid. She was Miss Amira, the one who helped find homes, who knew which doctors were kind, and who remembered everyone's name. She found herself laughing more, smiling more, and sleeping through the night. Her past was still with her, but it didn't define her anymore. It was the soil where she grew. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees, she sat on the shelter's porch with her notebook. The pages were full now, not with sadness, but with stories of women who fought to be seen, stories of survival, of power and dignity. She turned to a blank page and wrote, "I used to be invisible, now I'm seen. I used to whisper, now I speak. I used to serve without question, now I choose who I serve and why." She closed the notebook, smiling. She had found her place, not in serving others, but in her own strength. Then one day, a letter arrived. It came in a cream-colored envelope with a gold border. It was addressed to Miss Amira Holt, written in fancy handwriting. Vivian gave it to her, looking surprised. "This looks fancy," she said, handing it over. Amira opened the envelope carefully. Inside was an invitation to speak at the National Domestic Workers Alliance's annual conference. They wanted her to tell her full story to policymakers, advocates, and women from all over the country. She looked at the words for a long time. Since she started working at the shelter, her life had become calm and full. She had started trusting herself again. She could think without being afraid. But the idea of stepping back into the world, not as a shadow or a symbol, but as a woman who had gone through hard times and come out strong, made her feel both excited and scared. She didn't answer right away. The card stayed on her nightstand for days untouched. It waited, but it stayed in her mind. Every time she met a new person at the shelter, every time she had tea with a scared mother, every time a woman said thank you because she felt stronger, it reminded her of what she was thinking. She knew her silence had already made a big impact, and now she was ready to speak again, and said, but this time on her terms. She sent back her answer with a handwritten note and went back to her work without telling anyone. There was a new calm about her. She felt confident, deeper than before. She no longer wondered if what she said mattered. The day came when she traveled alone. She took an early train with a suitcase in her hand, wearing a soft gray dress that her sister had pressed for her the night before. The train station was quiet, the sun barely up, and the air smelled like rain-soaked earth. As the train moved forward, she watched the fields turn into cities and small towns become highways. The familiar sights behind her seemed to disappear like the last pages of a book. When she reached the capital, it was loud and crowded. There were tall glass buildings, and people walked quickly like they were busy. But she walked calmly through it, taking in the noise without letting it take over. She was here because she had said something to say. She wasn't just someone's worker. She was someone who had a voice. She reached the big conference center. It was tall and shiny, with banners hanging from the balconies. Each banner had big white letters saying dignity, voice, justice. Inside, there was a lot of talking and movement. It felt full of energy. She was taken backstage by a young assistant who looked nervous. "We are so honored to have you here," the assistant said, shaking a little. Amira smiled and said, "Thank you. I'm honored to be here." She waited backstage and listened to the speaker before her. He was talking about how women do a lot of unpaid work that helps build great things, but they don't get anything for it. When he finished, the audience clapped. Then the announcer said her name. When Amira walked on stage, the room became quiet. It wasn't because they weren't interested, but because they respected her. Hundreds of people were looking at her, waiting. She carefully adjusted the microphone and said, "I was a maid for 12 years. Her voice was strong and steady. "In a house where my name was barely said, where my sadness didn't matter, where I learned to disappear without leaving." She paused, letting the words settle in. Then she continued, I stayed because I was afraid. I thought silence was safer than the truth. I thought I didn't matter enough to speak. People in the audience were whispering, some were angry, some were sad, but she kept going. Silence doesn't protect us. It traps us. When I lost my father and they told me to keep working, when they said his funeral didn't fit their schedule, I realized the truth. She looked at the audience, locking eyes with a woman in the front row who had tears in her eyes. I was never invisible. They just didn't want to see me. She spoke for 20 minutes. She told them about the long nights, the humiliations, and how her spirit felt weak from working under shiny floors. She told them about leaving, the funeral in the rain, the letter her nephew helped her write, the storm of reactions after she left, and the shelter she worked at with women and children. She told them about the laughter and healing she found there. When she finished, the room was silent. There was no applause right away. People stood up, moved by her words. Then the applause came, loud and strong, full of appreciation. After her speech, people lined up to thank her. Some hugged her with tears in their eyes. Some just touched her arm and whispered, "Me too." Amira quietly went home. There was no big celebration. The train ride back was peaceful. The sun was setting, filling the sky with golden light. When she arrived at the station, Lorna was waiting for her, smiling, holding a thermos of warm ginger tea. No words were needed. Lorna's eyes said everything. Back at the shelter, things went back to normal. She filed papers, made tea, held hands, and handed out brochures. But something had changed. The women looked at her differently now, not with awe, but with understanding. She wasn't just a worker anymore. She was proof that it was possible to survive, to leave, and to speak. Weeks later, she returned to the graveyard at the edge of town. The grass was tall, slate, and the sunlight filtered through the trees. She stood in front of her father's grave. The wind gently moved her skirt as she knelt to brush away the leaves. "I did it, Papa," she said. "I kept my promise." She sat by the headstone for a while, letting the wind carry her voice as she softly told her father everything that had happened since she last visited. She told him about the letter, the speech, and how things had started to change. She told him about the women who came to the shelter, scared at first, but leaving with their heads held high. She told him about the children who ran and laughed in the halls. She told him about her voice, how it had once been quiet, and now it was heard by so many. As the sun began to set, she stood up, brushing off her skirt, and smiled. She no longer lived in silence. The silence that once felt so heavy was now waiting, listening. And when she spoke again, it listened. Thanks for watching. If you liked the story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Check out our other videos too. See you in the next one.